Welcome to Tea Time with the Jackson Center. I am Kristan McMahon, and I have the pleasure of serving as the president of the Robert H. Jackson Center in Jamestown, New York. We envision a world where the universal principles of equality, fairness, and justice prevail. 2021 is an important recognition year for us, for Justice Jackson, and for international humanitarian law. During the course of this year, we will be celebrating the 80th anniversary of Justice Jackson's appointment to the U.S. Supreme Court, the completion of the 75th anniversary of the Nuremberg trials and the birth of international humanitarian law, and the 20th anniversary of the Jackson Center. All of those milestones and our planning to celebrate or commemorate them naturally had us looking to the past to see how far we, the law, and the world have come. And of course, we cannot simply rest on our laurels. So we also started thinking about where are we trying to go and how do we get there? And that's part of the story of how we got to our 2021 programming theme, The Work Left to Do. During this year, we will be convening conversations about democracy, US and global institutions, human rights, and equity. We have structured our bi-monthly teas a little bit differently this year. Each month has a particular focus, and in April, we are looking at economic justice. The first tea each month is geared to provide you with an understanding of the work left to do to drive towards fairness, equality, equity, and justice. The second tea each month, which this is geared to showcase those actively doing the work to close those gaps. And we hope each of these programs inspires you to have conversations with your family, friends, networks, and colleagues to seek out ways to make change in your own communities. I also want to thank Humanities New York for the grant supporting our programming in the month of April. So for our second conversation of April, I am thrilled to welcome Rachel Braunstein, Managing Policy Attorney, and Naomi Young, Staff Attorney who oversees the Marital Debt Project for Her Justice. And Her Justice stands with women living in poverty in New York City by recruiting and mentoring volunteer lawyers to provide free legal help to address individual and systemic legal barriers. Rachel and Naomi, thank you so much for joining me for tea today.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
I always like to start these teas with a very foundational question. And so I'll ask each of you to start on this as well. How do you define economic justice? Rachel, I'm going to start with you.
Sure. So in our work on behalf of women living in poverty in New York City, I would define economic justice as the stability that women and their families need to get what they need and maintain their basic essentials, but with the agency to make decisions around how they get to that stability, however they define it for themselves.
Okay. And Naomi, what would your definition be?
I love that. I think that encompasses, the idea that a world that has economic justice would allow people to live with dignity and security so they can make meaningful choices in their life, choices that they want to be able to make instead of choices between like paying the rent or paying for groceries. I think one of my favorite quotes about economic justice is from Bryan Stevenson when he said that the opposite of poverty is not wealth, the opposite of poverty is justice. So I also think of economic justice as what it's not, and economic justice is not a system where poverty is considered like a necessary byproduct of the rest of us being allowed to be free to do whatever we want, and it's definitely not philanthropy or charity. It's justice.
We've had a lot of conversations over these first 4 months of the year talking about justice and how it's really those people living within the situation that should be the ones defining what justice means for them, as opposed to somebody from the top down saying, well, this is what justice looks like from my perspective. And I feel I'm intrigued by both the name Her Justice and sort of what was the need that needed to be filled or met in the communities when Her Justice was formed?
Well, I can say that we were formed 28 years ago by Catherine Douglas, who saw the great need among women living in poverty in New York City for legal help, for information, for access to the system, and were they to choose to engage in the legal system, for an advocate to help them through an overly complex and burdensome system. And the great resources and talents of the major law firms in the city who could provide pro bono assistance in that model. So that need continues to exist. Our court system has not become less complicated over the years, and it is singularly the burden of many women living in poverty to need to engage in that system to get the help they need. So with the need existing as it does, and in some ways certainly exacerbated by COVID, and the demand for help as large as ever, we continue to operate in this way.
So talk to us a little bit about what some of the foci are of her justice work, because as also part of our conversations have entailed, there is so much work to be done that no one organization can really tackle everything. So what are the areas that her justice tackles from this perspective?
So we serve women living in the 5 boroughs of New York City, in 5 boroughs, in the 5 main boroughs, in the areas of immigration, matrimonial, family law, and we do that through a kind of unique model where we work with the top law firms in New York City to scout their talent in order to provide free pro bono representation to way more women than Rachel or I or any of our 11, 12 colleagues right now could do on our own.
On that, I mean, just the numbers of training and the numbers of women that those who have trained, and I'm not going to remember these numbers specifically. So if you have them top of mind, I do remember it was more than 6,900 women and children had been helped in 2020. I want to say it was upwards of 14,000 attorneys who were working on that, but I might be misremembering those. So please correct me if I'm not getting those statistics right.
Yeah, I think that's the right number of women and children, but probably, if I'm right, more like 1,400 attorneys that we work with. And our staff are expert trainers. We work with attorneys who are extensively talented and great lawyers, but often don't have the substantive knowledge in the areas where we work. So our colleagues train, and Naomi herself and I once did train in child support or divorce, and also just sort of the nuts and bolts of how to go to family court, right? Most of the pro bono attorneys we work with don't know the family court well, and it's a real sort of inside baseball place, which is a real disadvantage, not only to the attorneys who volunteer their time, but for the many clients who we give advice to but are not able to represent, or for those who don't reach an organization like Her Justice, to get to know this sort of handshake system without an advocate is quite difficult. So we're expert trainers in the substantive areas of law, the practice, how to do the work, and that's how we're able to, with a relatively small staff, help many women and children a year.
That's perfect. So for our first conversation in April, Audra Wilson of the Shriver Center on Poverty Law said something that has stuck with me, and I think informs some of the work that you do as well. And what she said is that it costs money in this country to be poor. And that's not something that we think a lot about for those of us who are living above the poverty line or nowhere near the poverty line, depending on your socioeconomic status. And so I'm curious as to, do women experience poverty uniquely? And if so, how does that look for women living in poverty?
I'm really glad you brought up that quote. I think that's a really important concept that maybe, those of us who haven't had to experience that don't know it is really expensive to be living in poverty. I think one just like sort of salient example of that comes to mind with the work that I do, because I work in with consumer debt issues with our clients, and the ways that they overlap with family and matrimonial law. A person living in poverty who's depending on a credit card to pay for their bills, they are going to end up in a debt trap where they will never be able to pay off the interest on that credit card that they used for basic survival. A person who is well enough off to pay off their credit card every month is literally making money by using a credit card. If you are in this country and started out with the ability to get an education and get a job and have a steady source of income, then you continue to have sort of privileges heaped on you because of the way that our system works. You literally get money for free from your investments, from your credit card points, whatever it is. Whereas if you are a person living in poverty, everything costs money. I once had a client who got on a bus in New York City after putting quarters into a faulty ticket machine, and the machine gave her a ticket 25 cents short, and she got a $100 ticket for getting on the bus with a ticket that said she was 25 cents short. And there was no defense to that ticket under the law in New York. That is how expensive it is to be living in poverty in New York.
And that's such a great example, and a very upsetting one. And also, just to add to that, that as we said earlier, there are so many forms of relief that people living in poverty need that they can only get by engaging with the civil justice system, right? With the family courts, housing court, where we don't work, but is a related court area, the consumer debt courts, right? The costs of engaging in that system, where there are rampant delays, where even if you have a relatively simple, let's say a child support case that could be resolved within 2 court appearances, if both parents were educated and informed about what they needed to bring to court about their income, let's say, and the court were not burdened by so much volume that it could pay attention and give the time needed to that family when the family appears the first or second time, rather than 1 year later, 2 years later, that case finally getting resolved. Each time that you show up for court and maybe you're there for 10 minutes, you probably took a day off of work. And if you have the kind of a job that many of our clients have, where you lose wages for a day off of work, there's your cost, right? Of just engaging with the very system you need to engage with to get, in many cases, the financial relief you need. You're losing money. Maybe you had to hire childcare for the day, right? You said, oh, I'm supposed to show up at 9 a.m. And you do show up at 9 a.m. for your court appearance, and you're not heard by the court until 2:30. Now you've spent a day's worth of childcare. So these costs are real, and there are many costs to the system itself, but unfairly, our clients and women like them bear the burden disproportionately.
So we talked a little bit about the justice system and the pro bono model that Her Justice has. You all are also doing fairly significant, I would say, advocacy and policy work to address, Rachel, some of what you just described as there are ways the system could work better. And, obviously that would be a benefit, not just for the Her Justice clients, but for, a simplified justice system seems as if that would work better for most of us. So I want to dig into some of these bigger policy areas as well that you all are working on. And I'm going to start with, and I think these are probably somewhat related, but divorce and child support. So the matrimonial side of the policy work. And I think I'm going to be asking this question a lot. How does divorce impact women living in poverty differently than it might someone not living in poverty?
So first of all, I think every court in the country, a divorce is a complex legal case in that it involves a lot of different legal issues, and you would benefit from legal representation no matter where you are in the country and no matter who it is that's getting divorced. New York happens to have uniquely one of the most complicated, actually the most complicated court system in the country. And so to navigate divorce court in particular is incredibly difficult for you if you're pro se. So if you're looking at a divorce, and even if it's a fairly straightforward divorce, and you're like, I could maybe handle this on my own, you go to court, they hand you a stack of papers that's literally this thick and tell you, okay, fill all those out in the right order, file those in the right order, serve them in the right order, then file them again in the right order with absolutely zero errors, and then you will get a divorce in about a year. And that's an insurmountable barrier for someone to do on their own, typically. I mean, people do it against all odds, but that's really difficult. If you then go and try and find an attorney, sort of a lower tier, family matrimonial attorney in New York's gonna, and elsewhere in the country as well, is going to cost you $300, $500 an hour just to retain them. Might cost you $1,500 just to retain them, maybe more than that. And that's, if we've got clients who don't even have that in their bank accounts, typically, they're definitely not going to be able to do that. A lot of times people call us who have been separated from their spouse for decades, and the only reason they haven't gotten divorced is because of how prohibitive it is to navigate the system on your own and the inability to hire an attorney. So the experience of just getting a divorce decree, even if both of them really want one, that's really hard. But the thing about divorces is they are incredibly high stake. So if you have children in a marriage, your divorce necessarily implicates custody. It implicates the support for our clients. Child support and spousal support is often their number one, and Rachel will talk about this more, their number one source of income. That is life or death. Like, that is rent or no rent. That is food or no food for them. If they invested in anything in the marriage, then it's also going to involve something like usually the family home is the biggest asset that parties might have. A lot of times, and this is kind of a gendered issue that was a huge part of the women's movement, but still continues to be an issue for our clients, is that a lot of times mothers are asked to stay at home with the kids, so they don't have their own retirement savings. So the other big asset that we usually see dividing up in a divorce is the retirement accounts of typically the husband, not always, heterosexual marriages. However, that's often the dynamic that we see. And that's, the only retirement savings that our client may expect to have in their later years. Many of our clients are already in their later years. And then, the big issue that we were hoping to address with the Marital Debt Project is that, clients who are getting divorced and live in poverty, their big issue is not a ton of complicated assets. It's typically debt. And so there's these marriages that contain a lot of debt in them, whether that's a mortgage or whether that is often, a lot of credit card debt that was taken out in order to support the kids, sometimes auto loans. And a lot of times this debt arises out of economic abuse by the other person, whether that's identity theft, coercion, or just the overall coercive effect of an abusive relationship where they're controlling the family finances. So all of that happens in a divorce. All of that could, really benefit from an attorney and access to justice.
I want to unpack a little bit of what you said there and give a little more space to talk about the marital debt program, because I think for a lot of our audience, those concepts that you just sort of walked through would be, again, something that they probably have never had to deal with your spousal partner opening credit cards in your name, and racking up debt through that, or controlling all of the finances so that you can really he or she will only give you money on occasion, or on some schedule. I'm sure it's not always just here's money periodically, but could you talk a little bit more about some of the types of the things that you were seeing that led, because the Marital Debt Project itself is only about 3 years old, not quite 3 years old, if I'm remembering correctly. So 2018. So what was it that you all were seeing that you're like, yes, no, we need like an entirely separate track here to deal with these issues?
Yeah, so this really predates me, because I came on because Rachel's policy, Rachel's practice group was recognizing these issues. So it's my colleague like Rachel who've been there much longer than I, who were noticing, this huge, hugely unsatisfactory endings to divorces, where there's debt that you aren't able to address in a divorce. So my supervisor, Anna Ognaveni, is the one who came up with the idea for the Marital Debt Project, and who recruited me to get a fellowship, because she was hoping that we would be able to provide a more holistic approach. A lot of times, it's not just our clients who are living in poverty, their spouses are as well. So there's a limited value that you might get out of a divorce judgment in terms of being able to address a lot of liabilities, right? So, maybe you could say that the spouse is required to indemnify our clients for 50% of the credit card debt accrued during the marriage. But if he doesn't have any assets or income that you're going to be able to seize from him in order to pay off those debts, that judgment is going to have a limited value to our client. And so Anna's, seeing all our clients walking away from their divorces still super economically insecure. And so she thought, well, what if we were also addressing the consumer issues there? Something that we, knew, but didn't know until we started the project and started to track this more, is that it's not just our divorce clients, because we also, we practice in immigration law, and a lot of our family court clients are not married. The vast majority of our clients have debt. And by debt, we mean, debts they haven't paid, like defaulted on. It's rent arrears, utility arrears, credit card debt, because of the high cost of living in New York, couldn't possibly be paid with either government benefits or, employment income. Like, that's just not feasible. And so, we're seeing this across the board in the divorces itself. The idea was I would, represent clients in the more complex litigated divorces that involved multiple financial issues. And then also see what I could do on the consumer end, whether that meant if the client was being sued in civil court by a creditor, also providing defense to her in that case, or that whether that just meant making sure that we were at minimum looking at those issues, making sure she's referred to financial advising, and to get a sense of what steps might take place next, whether that's, talking to the credit reporting agencies, whether that's thinking about bankruptcy down the line, but just having this greater sense that it's, for our clients to walk away with an economic success story, it's going to take a lot more than just a divorce.
And Rachel, I think I want to bring in some of your experience with child support in this area as well. There were some statistics on the Her Justice website that I think are very illustrative here. So 80% of single parent homes are headed by mothers, and the poverty rate for those families is almost twice that of single parent homes headed by fathers, which I was just astonished to see. What are some of the challenges within the child support area of the marital advocacy work that you're doing as well, that from a system standpoint and from how the justice system is working, where are the challenges? How's it working?
Right. So yeah, those statistics are pretty staggering, and those are national statistics. And we started to think a lot about child support as an area of policy reform. In part, again, all of our policy work is informed by the work that we do on behalf of our clients, right? We see need across each individual case over all these years. And then we start to say, well, what are the systemic issues here? So in child support, it's an area where we focus our client services, in part because they are cases that really benefit from lawyers when they're complicated, because the system is quite complicated. And our pro bono model works well. We can often get help pro bono from financial accounting firms, forensic accounting firms, where there's hidden asset. where there is a cash business. So these are the cases, not the cases that Naomi was describing, where there's poverty on both sides, for both parents, right? These, we take the hard cases where we think there is income to be ordered to be paid to a child for the sake of a child, and where there's really need for representation. The fact is, on a systemic level, that the child support system in New York is quite complex. As Naomi said, New York has the most complex court system. And many of our child support cases, I should clarify, are for non-married parents. So it's not just coming out of our divorce work, but of course, child support is frequently an issue within divorces. If you're a non-married parent or a married parent, you can go to family court in New York, but 90% of people in family court have no lawyers on child support cases. And again, these are cases that are about money. They're income-focused cases. And we do a lot of these ourselves, as I said, and yet 90% of cases proceed without lawyers. And so we knew there was a significant invisibility around child support as a gender justice issue, an economic justice issue, a racial justice issue, because most of our clients are Black and brown women and people of color, and that is the case with those toiling through family court. So we knew that it would be a benefit if we could take another angle on this problem at a systemic level and really push the envelope on the fact that the courts don't share a lot of data about what happens in these cases. There's sort of, we don't know the nature of these cases, sort of from an aggregate standpoint. We don't know what happens in terms of outcome in these cases, again, on a sort of mass level. And so we decided to do a court watch project where we sent about 90 volunteers into the New York City family courts over a 2-year period, and they observed 800 child support cases. And we designed a protocol in collaboration with the Fund for Modern Courts, which has done citizen-based court watch projects before and has expertise in this area. And we asked the observers to report back to us on various sort of nature of the case type of things. Look, could they tell how many times this family had been before the judge or the magistrate? Could they tell what the issues were? Were there lawyers? Were there interpreters for those for whom English is not a native language? And also things like, what did it feel like to be in this courtroom? If you're standing in the shoes of the litigants, the parents in the courtroom, as you do when you're doing court watching, did people have chance to ask questions? Did the magistrate explain technical terms, right? What was that procedural fairness feeling? What did it look like from, again, fairness and understanding perspective? And also, how much time were these folks in front of the magistrate? And on average, the appearances we observed lasted 11 minutes. Slightly longer for a trial, slightly less for where there was no other parent showing up. And we, in many ways, we know these things. Like Naomi knows these things from practice. Our colleagues know these things from representing women. But to take another angle on the problem, and while a very small sample set, I mean, there are more than 200,000 child support filings in a normal year in New York State. So 800 is quite a small number. We wanted to demonstrate the need for and the benefit of collecting data, of surfacing the way that these cases are being handled for the sake of the individuals whose cases they are, whose lives are being determined. I mean, as Naomi said, the work is high stakes. So whose lives are being determined, rent, no rent, food, no food, by the outcome of these cases in many circumstances, but also for the system, right? We know that there are too many cases going through the family courts to have each magistrate in an under-resourced court spend the necessary amount of time, right? But we also know that litigants show up to court without information, without documentation. There's financial literacy, right, that poses a barrier. So there are lots of access points and reform points for the sake of the system and for the sake of the individuals using it, that we're very hopeful that this data kicks off a conversation toward.
Well, and that was going to be my next question with regard to both of these. How how and to where do you make recommendations as to how the system could function better in this particular instance? And what does that look like? So as you're collecting this data, what comes next? What do you do with it next?
Well, on the child support work, one of the things that we want to explore is the idea that is not specific only to child support, I would say, as a civil justice reform issue, but that certainly has application here, which is that if you are poor or living in poverty or low income, you rarely have a menu of options for how you engage with the civil justice system, right? If you can afford an attorney, you and your attorney sit down at a table, hammer out an agreement, whether it's on custody, child support, divorce, and then you can largely avoid the many months long or years long process that we're talking about many of our clients go through in family court or divorce court and Supreme Court to get help, right? You can shortcut that burden, essentially. You can lift it off yourself and put it somewhere else. You can't do that if you can't afford an attorney. And the legal services field is incredibly impactful, and her justice included, but we can't serve all the demand out there. So one of the things we're really interested in is, what does a menu of options look like for some of the issues that we focus on? And we're not the only folks thinking about this, but on the child support issue, is there a way to handle simple cases in a simple way? Does the one sort of courthouse door fits all solution really work? And again, from a system perspective, as much as for the individual. So one of the things we're researching is, what could an alternative look like for those who really don't have a disputed child support case or child support issue between them? I also, out of our Court Watch report comes some recommendations about simplification of the process sort of at the beginning, right? So I alluded to folks coming to court without information. People don't understand their rights. I mean, our organization is dedicated to outreach in communities to inform people about their rights, but that is a lot of work, and there's a lot of need out there. And so we intend to do more. At the same time, the information that folks are presented with before they even get to court, there's something called a financial disclosure affidavit that's used in a child support case, similar to something that's used in a divorce case. Many people do not understand this pages long form, right? So does it make a lot of sense that that's the bit of information that you're giving to people to equip them to participate, accountably in the system themselves, right? To come with the information so that it doesn't get postponed for lack of documentation. So I think these kinds of things are issues that we want to move forward with in terms of court reform, and working with our partners in the courts, and thinking bigger also about sort of a fix or a solution that comes from elsewhere, whether it's from the legislature, whether it's from the administrative agencies, and really thinking big picture about holistic reform that we hope is, again, kicked off by this work that we did.
That sounds great. Yes, as anybody who's ever struggled through reading in the instructions for basically any form you've needed to fill out for a state or federal government, you sometimes wonder if you no longer speak English in terms of reading those. And for those of your clients who actually English is not their first language, I can only imagine that extra level of challenge to navigate that. One of the other main policy areas, and Rachel, you alluded to this earlier as well, and actually I think Naomi, you did too, is the immigration side of things, and that a number of your clients are also trying to navigate immigration services. And so I would love for you to talk a little bit about so for your clients, and actually I'm going to start with a very specific conversation thing because it's a recent development in New York State. So as part of the budget that was recently passed, there have been about $2.1 billion worth of funds that have been allocated as a one-time payment to undocumented immigrant workers. And this has kicked off a lot of discussions as to how does this how does this function from a process standpoint, but also why is this necessary? And so I have to imagine that a number of your clients would be impacted by something like this. So I'd love to get your thoughts on this allocation. What need is it filling, and go from there.
Sure, I can start, Naomi, and then if you have something to add, please do. I mean, this is hugely important for New Yorkers who are undocumented. And as you say, many of our clients are undocumented. We have a very robust immigration practice. Our immigration work focuses on clients who have survived gender-based violence. And the economic justice issues for our clients are significant, right? If they don't have status, then they may not have work authorization. They may not have legal permission to work. And as with many of our clients, they're single mothers raising families. So the economic issues that we've talked about in child support and divorce, right, cross-cut and affect our immigrant clients significantly. So what we've seen over the last several years is that many of our immigrant clients haven't been eligible for some of the stimulus payments that have been made, and at the same time have been frontline workers, essential workers, the ones hardest hit by the effects of the pandemic, single parents without childcare, without school to send their children to. So hardest hit with no safety net at a time that they need it most. I should also say, to the point earlier about family courts, where many of our immigrant clients do file for child support or other financial relief, the family courts in New York City have essentially been closed during the pandemic for this kind of need. So without any of that support, this kind of move from the state is incredibly significant. There are other things like extending healthcare coverage to all New Yorkers who need it that we've been behind, coming out of the need of our immigrant clients.
Got it. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about some of the immigration work that Her Justice does for your clients, because I think some of these, again, are going to be some new concepts for us. So the U visas and the work permits, in terms of, I guess, what is the work, or what is the workaround for that in terms of, I think there is a misperception that if you are in this country without the proper documentation, that you are not contributing to the society. And I think part of this conversation around U visas and the work permits probably is directly addressing that. So I'd love to start there.
Sure, Naomi, do you want to take it, or you want me to start?
No, go for it. Go for it.
So just to start at fundamentals, U visas are their applications for status that folks can file who are victims of crime. That set of crimes under the law includes acts of intimate partner violence and gender-based violence. So the U visas that we file on behalf of clients are tied to those acts against them. So along the pathway to status, to get a U visa, applicants are entitled to legal work authorization. In the last 4 or 5 years, the timeline to obtain work authorization, ultimately to obtain a U visa, has lengthened dramatically. And so, whereas it used to take about 1 year for immigrant applicants for U visas to get a work permit, it now takes sometimes up to 5 years. So we have been, our amazing immigration team, and I am not an immigration expert myself, although I do the policy work with our team, but our amazing team of immigration lawyers has met the unbelievable demand for help from really clients who have been in crisis over these last several years, with the delays that are just unjust, to put it lightly. So, our clients are providers for their families. They always have been, and they continue to be. And despite the delays in systems, they continue to provide. So our clients are workers, they're home health workers, they're domestic workers, they're work in retail, work in stores, right? Grocery stores. So they've continued to do the work that they need to do to survive, but with the burden of this systemic delay, just to make matters incredibly worse. So we have, I think we sit in a unique position doing the policy work we do because we work as an organization with individuals and because we also work on system change. So one of the things we've done on this issue, which we continue to do, especially given the impact of COVID and the pandemic on our clients, especially our immigrant clients, is to tell their stories in a way to advocate for change. So we did a project a few years ago where we in-depth interviewed 20 of our immigrant clients about the impact of waiting for work authorization on their lives. How did it affect their housing stability? How did it affect their safety, right? These are all women who have survived and fled from intimate partner violence. So what did it look like for their safety, for them to be waiting for legal permission to work from the government? What did it look like for their working conditions? As I said, these women are providers for their families. Were their working conditions changed when they did get work authorization? Did they get a different job? Were their wages increased? So all of these kinds of real life, right? What is the real life impact of policy on people? And so we sort of analyzed what we learned from our clients and in some ways confirmed what we knew and in a lot of ways surprised us, which is in my experience, amazing thing about doing policy work with individuals impacted by policy is to learn new things. So we have used that set of information to talk with partners at the national level about federal immigration reform and continue to think about ways, as I said, to unearth the story from the last year, which might be more of the same, but might look different for our clients and what we need to be considering and pushing policymakers to consider going forward.
So a related question, I think, because I feel as if there is a general sentiment that if you are an undocumented immigrant, you should not receive any access or support by the system. And so I'm curious as to what do you say to people who have that mindset? How, and I'm not sure if, there's the ability to convince them. It probably takes many conversations, but as a shorthand or as some talking points, how do we start addressing that and start changing that mindset?
I think Rachel already, mentioned this multiple times about how those clients are our essential workers. None of us would be here or doing as well coming out of a pandemic if it weren't for our immigrant population in the United States. Obviously, none of us would be here if our ancestors hadn't immigrated here at all. So, there's just that perspective of like, who thinks that they've earned a place, at the table, who thinks they've earned, their right to live in comfort, and what makes you more worthy than another person. And that, one really, obvious example is that our clients are mostly paying taxes. That's one thing that our immigration attorneys, always, are advising clients to do. You get, an ITIN, even if you don't have a social security number, and you begin paying taxes. Our clients are contributing in a lot of ways. The sort of disturbing thing is not only do we deny our clients our immigrant populations basic human rights like healthcare and benefits, our system still sees them as profitable, even though they don't see them as, human. So I am seeing clients who've developed a credit history, maybe a negative one with an ITIN, because financial institutions see them as profitable and they prey on them. Predatory lenders see them as profitable and prey on them. And obviously our entire system sees them as profitable and preys on their labor. So that's my like little bit of a soapbox. I don't know if Rachel, you would have something a little more concise to say to our naysayers.
No, I think that's right. Well said.
Okay, perfect. Rachel, you had mentioned one for as part of the U visas, the intimate partner violence aspect of that. And my understanding from doing my research for this conversation was that the legal system has sort of one definition of intimate partner violence, and her justice thinks it perhaps should be a little bit broader than that. So I'd love to start with what is IPV currently defined as, and then how would her justice modify that definition?
So it's interesting when we talk about the policy work that we do, there are many instances where the law is strong. I mean, New York has progressive, strong laws in the human rights realm, in the family law realm. There are many instances where that's not the fix, it's the implementation, the application of the law. And I think in many ways our state and local definitions of intimate partner violence are strong, right? They account for not just the physical harm that one partner wields on another, but the psychological impact of that harm. Where we have seen the need for pushing for change is around the economic abuse piece that we see in many of our clients' lives, right? So that, and by that I mean, and Naomi might even have a more eloquent definition of this at her fingertips, but what I would say for that is that economic abuse, which is almost always, I think statistics show, a part of intimate partner violence, looks like coercion, isolation around the finances in the couple. And that, I mean, you heard Naomi talk about the way that our clients are strapped with debt coming out of relationships. There are identity theft issues and others that flow frequently that take years to recover, right? So I think recovery, in my mind, I have sort of a prevention mindset sometimes, but on the back end of that sort of treatment and recovery, I think the laws are good, right? We see you recover from the physical effects, the psychological effects. We are maybe even doing better than we once did there. But in terms of what does it look like to pick up the pieces of economic abuse that almost all survivors have experienced, we see the need for the laws to get stronger around that so that recovery works. I mean, just one example of that is several years ago, we were involved in an effort with other advocates to have the city of New York pass a paid safe leave bill. And that bill, which is somewhat similar to a paid sick leave bill, right? So it's paid time off of work. And the paid safe leave bill was for survivors of intimate partner violence to take paid time off of work so that they could deal with the consequences of intimate partner violence, right? Recognizing that work and IPV are connected, right? I said before, people go to court, miss work. So for those who are domestic violence survivors or IPV survivors who need to go seek medical care, mental health care, legal services as a result of that abuse, the law adapted. And so New York City a few years ago passed such a law. So those are the areas that I think we're doing a lot of work. And then I think also, I don't know if Naomi will have something to say on this as a lawyer in the courts, but in lawyering, we do a lot of work to push this forward, right? So not even just law change, but even sometimes where there are strong laws, our lawyers push forward for change in individual cases.
Mm-hmm. I just, like, as an aside, just want to say for anyone who's watching is like, oh gosh, I wish I could someday do policy work like Rachel Braunstein. You mentioning that paid leave act, I literally watched Rachel testify to the New York City Council way back when I was a law student, and now I get to work with her. And so I'm super thrilled for that honor. Just been doing the work and making a big difference in clients' lives. Absolutely. I think you touched on economic abuse. Our current laws don't really define that, and it's a huge gap that we're trying to address, and make that, that's been known for a long time in the research on domestic violence, that the number one reason that people are unable to leave a violent situation is economic reasons. And at the same time, those economic reasons are caused by the abuse. And that can look like, someone maybe withholding, your income from you, giving you an allowance to live off of, showing up at your workplace and getting you fired. Like, these are all things that we hear about all of the time that you may not think of as forms of abuse, but they are. And the reason our clients can't leave, especially in New York, is where on earth are you going to find the rent to pay if you're in that kind of a situation? So, what we're seeing, and to Rachel's point about, like, we're going into court, also trying to push that different definition, to a certain extent. You've got certain definitions, like we have identity theft was recently, relatively, okay, not that recent, but relatively recently in the vast history of New York law, added to the Family Court Act as a family offense. So that would be, alongside things like assault and harassment. And it's underused because, as Rachel's also said, the vast majority, over 90% of litigants in family court are unrepresented. How would they know that the Family Court Act includes something like identity theft, and think that you might be able to get something like restitution if you were to go and bring a family offense petition? So there's last I checked, no case law on identity theft as a family offense. It's also obviously a crime in the state of New York. And so, being able to try and identify those cases and litigate them. And obviously when you are doing direct services, you are, serving the client's needs and not necessarily pushing a political agenda or trying to do impact litigation. But to the extent that you are educating judges, maybe a little bit, and trying to educate the system as a whole. If you go to the police and you say someone stole my identity, I guarantee you they won't give you a police report, even though it's on the books as a crime. We see it again and again and again with the NYPD, and I know advocates across the country have the same issue with law enforcement. The reason that's important is because the credit reporting agencies aren't going to take it off your credit report unless you show them a police report. It also matters in, the family offense cases as well. So I've got a client who, the NYPD refuses to give her a police report when her husband steals her identity. So then we go to family court, and I tell the judge this is what happened. The judge says, that sounds like a criminal issue. Get it out of my court. Literally, true story. And so these are, multiple areas of the justice system, from the criminal to the family court, that are not identifying what abuse looks like and giving people meaningful relief. We're not even talking about, being punitive here. It's more about can we get this person relief from what's on her credit report, relief from, what the money she needs to recover from this situation. And so that's what we're in safety. Obviously, when you're filing a family offense petition, you're looking for that to not happen to you again. And so that's what we'd like to see, a little bit more of a definition that encompasses more of the reality of what our clients go through, so that they can seek those types of relief, whether it's safety or economic relief.
So we have a couple of questions from our audience that I'll ask now before we get to the lightning round. So the first question is from Helena, and she's asking, do you feel a need to actively rebuild trust in the immigrant community based on fears of deportation? How has some of the conversations and some of these challenges with the system played out with that?
I'll say that it's a great question, and one we thought a lot about after the federal election in 2016, where we saw that folks were reaching out for help less. And we thought, well, we're already a trusted player to many of our clients and in their communities, certainly don't serve all the communities that need help. what can we do about that? So we really ramped up our outreach work to go to where the need was. And that continues to be work that we focus on. We know that we're lawyers, many of us, and we know that folks don't always know that they have a problem that the law can address. And even if they do know that the law might address their problem, they might not want to come forward. So we really thought a lot about that in terms of meeting people where they are instead of expecting and waiting for that need to come to us.
And then the second question we have is, are you seeing support from some adjacent bureaus? So they specifically mentioned the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. You mentioned Naomi, some of the conversations you're having, it's almost like you're going in circles. You know, this is not, you need the documentation from here, but they are like, no, it's fine. And so when you show up at the court, so are you seeing support from adjacent bureaus or adjacent organizations that you need, or there's some that maybe need a little bit of a shot in the arm or some convincing that they should get involved?
No, obviously certain administrations are more likely than others to be moved by these stories and moved to action. And obviously the CFPB was, created for consumers. So definitely you see a lot of really helpful public notices coming out of the CFPB. So we definitely see them as an ally. I think one thing that, our pie in the sky, the coalitions that I get to be involved in would like to see is, clients no longer needing a law enforcement report. One effort to avoid having clients, and obviously the vast majority of the folks that we work with, I shouldn't say obviously, but the vast majority of the folks that we work with are people of color, including Black and Brown folks who going to the police, it's a different story for them than for many of us who are brought up to believe that the police protect us. That's a very different story. And a lot of times for victims of violence, going to the police means you get re-victimized because of their response to allegations of gender-based violence. And so, there's a lot of complications there. So one agency that came up with a great, hopefully great, that we're, still trying to use in a lot of different ways. The Federal Trade Commission, you can make a report of identity theft to the Federal Trade Commission. And that's, a sworn statement. So I always have clients do that. And try and use that in advocacy. So it's more of a push to the credit reporting agencies to be more responsive to that as well. But yeah, definitely some partnership there. And then on the issue that Rachel kind of touched on the stimulus check, stolen stimulus checks are not going to a lot, didn't go to a lot of our immigrant clients. For a lot of our clients who would have been entitled to the stimulus payments, they did not get them because their abusers filed for taxes and received the stimulus themselves, and of course withheld them from our clients. So that's been a big issue across the board. And I think we're talking about who would be helpful in that, what agencies would be helpful in that that sort of issue. Obviously talking, what role could the IRS play in helping survivors of domestic violence and issues that involve taxes. And there's certain things in law that do address intimate partner violence, like innocent spouse relief. But I think there's conversations to be had there as well.
Okay. All right, the lightning round. What progress do you hope to see in the next year? And Rachel, we'll start with you.
I hope to see that the family court system in New York thinks differently about how people access it and how it can be less of a burden in their lives.
Okay, Naomi.
I love that. I would second that. I would love to see people feeling safer and more welcomed in our communities.
Okay. And then Naomi, what gives you hope that progress will be made?
I think working with communities. We're doing coalition work and seeing that the political energy of many people who are identifying the same issues, and always, our clients, continuing to demand what's owed to them.
Okay, Rachel?
Ever the optimist that even systems want to do better. I think that, sort of a phoenix out of the ashes, that out of this terrible, unfortunate crisis, there is opportunity for change, and it's happening. There's discussion happening about change. And so that in itself gives me hope that something good will come out of it.
Okay. And Rachel, who else is doing good work to make progress?
So, lately I'm following a lot of the organizations that are talking about moms and women and the need for childcare and women working in the care economy in particular. So we recently, as an organization, talked to the National Women's Law Center, and there are folks in New York City whose name I'm forgetting who are doing really interesting stuff around that. But I'm really hopeful that we can have some synergies with that movement, because I think we're talking about the same moms and same women who are struggling in poverty and need the same kinds of policy reform.
Okay, and Naomi?
I'm excited to see, national groups or groups in other states who are doing a lot of the same work that we do. Like, for instance, there are other advocates who are specifically looking at the intersection of domestic violence and consumer debt. And so I have a lot to learn from lawyers in Texas and Maine, for instance. And so I'm excited to see that work that's developing and get to learn from them.
Okay. And then the final lightning round question is, how can we as an audience better educate ourselves on some of these issues? So what are some books or articles we should be reading, podcasts, people who are doing the thinking part of this that we should be tuning into? Naomi, I'm going to start with you on that one.
Thanks. I have to keep educating myself. I have a really long reading list that I haven't gotten through. I'm excited for the release this summer of a book, one of the co-authors of which is Angela Davis, on abolition feminism now. Just read Women, Race, and Class for the first time, and probably should have read that a long time ago to get a sense of where our history has brought us, and kind of unlearn the history we already know, and just trying to prioritize reading a lot of books by Black women. I mentioned Brian Stevenson earlier. If you haven't read Just Mercy, that's one of the most powerful books I've ever read. And then if you like fiction, I love fiction. One book that I read recently that I felt like really spoke to kind of the experiences that a lot of our clients go through, and the kind of intersecting issues and dynamics of immigration and family, and abuse, particularly in New York City. There's this book called Dominicana by Angie Cruz that was just delightfully written, and it's kind of loosely based on the author's mother moving from the Dominican Republic to New York.
Okay, and Rachel?
I hope, Naomi, that you will email me those suggestions later because they're so great.
I would say email all of us. We'll post it too. So
beautiful, because I wanted to write it down while she was talking. Agree on the lifelong learning, trying to listen to so many things. We recently had the opportunity to talk to the folks at Pod Save the People, who are doing some really interesting civil rights analysis. And a book I read ages ago when I was working with Her Justice in our then Bronx office, which always stuck with me and is, I thought, an amazing way to learn about these issues, is called Random Family by Adrienne Nicole LeBlanc. And that she's a journalist who embeds herself in a community of folks who are some chosen family, some actual family. I thought it was a stunning portrayal of, I'm sure, many issues that persist, and that was written probably 20 years ago, but I would recommend it.
Okay, great. Well, I would like to thank our audience for joining us for tea today. An upcoming program note, because in April we have a bonus tea. So we will have a third tea next week, Thursday, April 29th at 3 p.m. Eastern. So same bat channel, same bat station, or same bat channel, same bat time. I did not do that correctly. And I will be joined by Sarah Ludwig, who is a co-founder and the director of the New Economy Project. Also based in New York City. And so we'll be talking to them. They'll be our final economic justice conversation of April and tackling this from a slightly different vantage point. So we can always have our brains working. And thank you again to Humanities New York for the grant supporting our programming this month. And Rachel and Naomi, thank you so much for joining us and challenging us and educating us. And we know these conversations never really end. So we'll keep doing the work, and thank you for the work that you're doing.
Thank you so much for having us.